Welcome back to Act 2, and our topic for the coming hour is moral character in the presidency. My name is Colin Murphy. I'm the managing editor of the Atlantic Monthly. I'm a member of the board of the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities, and nice to have you all back after the intermission. Moral character in the presidency, I'm sure it's a pair of concepts that are sometimes intimately entwined and sometimes in a state of creative tension. And we have three distinguished panelists and a terrific moderator to talk about this. To my left here, Doug Wilson is Professor Emeritus of English at Knox College and co-director of the Lincoln Studies Center. He's the author of Jefferson's books, Lincoln Before Washington, Honor's Voice, The Transformation of Abraham Lincoln, and is currently working on a new book called Lincoln's Sword. To Doug's left is Susan Dunn. Susan is a professor of humanities at Williams College and the co-author with James McGregor Burns of The Three Roosevelts, Patrician Leaders Who Transformed America, and George Washington. Her newest book, Jefferson's Second Revolution, The Election Crisis of 1800 and the Triumph of Republicanism, was published this fall. To Susan's left is Ronald Waters, director of the African American Leadership Institute and Scholar Practitioner Program, distinguished leadership scholar at the James McGregor Burns Academy of Leadership, and professor in government and politics at the University of Maryland. Waters is the author of 6 books, including Black Presidential Politics in America. And at the far left, our moderator, David Gergen, who is the editor-at-large at U.S. News and World Report and professor of public service and director of the Center for Public Leadership at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. He's the author of Eyewitness to Power, The Essence of Leadership, Nixon to Clinton. And the word eyewitness in that title is to be taken literally. David has served a number of American presidents, most recently I think, Bill Clinton. Take it away.
Thank you, Colin. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here today. I'm delighted to see so many, and particularly pleased to see so many scholars here, especially James McGregor Burns, who is, could, I think, sit in front of us on all 3 of these panels and do it entirely by himself, and we'd all leave feeling edified and entirely satisfied with the occasion. Well, we're glad to see you, sir, here. We do have a wonderful panel, and indeed someone who's co-authored books with Jim Burns and Susan Dunn. And we're posing questions that are as old as politics itself. Aristotle spent a great deal of time thinking about the character of leaders, the importance of character to the civic virtue of the state, of a society. And these questions, of course, continue down to our own day when, as recently as in this election, moral values seem to be such an important consideration for those who were voting. So these are age-old questions, but still extremely relevant. And I hope that in this brief hour together, we can explore them in ways that you will find provocative and go beyond the obvious. So let's start, if I might, or if we might, with Susan Dunn, who has recently co-authored a book on George Washington. And it seems only fitting that we might begin a discussion about moral character in the presidency with the founder, a man who said early, as he was approaching the presidency, that we now have to put a stamp of character upon the nation. He had worked his entire life to develop his own character, but he wanted then to develop the character of the nation. And he, perhaps foremost among our presidents, thought deeply or acted upon a set of ideas relating to character. So Susan, if you could tell us about Washington and character, what he shows us about character in the presidency, then we'll turn to Doug Wilson and ask about Lincoln, and then Ron Walters can reflect upon those comments, and we'll go from there. Susan Dunn.
Well, when Washington became president in 1789, there was no nation. There was only the paper shell of the Constitution. And people didn't have a sense of nationhood or of belonging to a nationhood. People were loyal to Virginia, to Massachusetts, to Connecticut. And it was George Washington who had to breathe life into the Constitution to create a sense of nationhood and to build citizens' loyalties to this new entity, the United States. And he did that via his own character. He incarnated the nation with the values that he believed in, but more than that, with his courage, with his commitment to unity. And that was the theme that he stressed throughout his presidency. And in addition, if the United States had developed a parliamentary model of government, as was discussed during the Constitutional Convention, for the most part, a president elected by Congress, then there might have been two heads of state, a head of government and a ceremonial head of state. But since we went with a presidency, the president had to incarnate both positions, the head of government and the ceremonial symbolic head of nation. And it was Washington's genius that he was able to fulfill both roles so brilliantly. People did look at him as the ceremonial and symbolic incarnation of the nation, and he was an extremely effective head of state.
His character, his personal character, and how that affected his leadership. I would deal basically with what his integrity, his ethics, and his belief in the public values, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's where, for me, that's the greatness of his character, that he was able to steer the country in the right direction. The lower level, I agree with Jack Beatty about the sexual behavior and what we call virtuous behavior. We put that at the bottom, the lower scale of character, how whether one is faithful to one's spouse, whether one is a good neighbor, whether one goes to church. I don't think that that really counted much for Washington. As far as moral values, which we talk about so much today, Washington was an Enlightenment man. At most, he was a deist. He was not a churchgoer. He believed in reason and using human rationality to make people happy, to help them pursue happiness. And I think that was Washington's greatness and the greatness of his character, that he believed in reason. And because he believed in reason, he was tolerant of other people, because he believed in reason enough to know that reason is fallible, not infallible. And so it made him very open to other people, to their ideas, their political positions. And I think that combination of commitment to unity, belief in reason, tolerance, and of course his great courage that he demonstrated throughout his life, especially as commander-in-chief, that together consolidated into a remarkable character that all other presidents are measured against. Let me ask you about one other aspect of his character that seems particularly relevant today, and that was his self-restraint. That Washington had enormous power as the commander-in-chief of the American military forces, and that he was willing to give that power up rather than become a dictator. He did that willingly, voluntarily, and King George said if he were to do that, he would make him the greatest man in the world. And then again, he gave up power as president. He voluntarily walked away from the office. Gary Wills has written that it was Washington's willingness to give up power was actually his greatest gift to the nation. And at a time when we have so much power as a people in the world, it seems to me that there's possibly some lesson there, and I wanted to see if you could explore that for us about the exercise of power in the world, about the self-restraint is a part of character as well.
Exactly. The founders all had that moderation, that self-restraint, and it really comes to the fore when you compare them with revolutionaries in France. The French Revolution is going on at exactly the same time. When Washington begins his second term in 1793, the King of France is being beheaded. And why, in a nutshell, the answer is the self-restraint that the American founders were able to show, and the complete lack of self-restraint on the part of French leaders. Even later, in Washington's presidential career, he was very much opposed to political parties. Again, he stressed unity. He was very upset when not only there was dissension in his own cabinet, but when he was attacked in the press. But he did nothing about that. He didn't take any action to repress dissent or to repress opposition. He didn't want it, but again, he showed that self-restraint, that moderation, and that tolerance not to take action, whereas in France, the situation was exactly the opposite. They purged dissent. They thought they were creating what we would call a one-party democracy and killed everyone who opposed them, and that was what we call the terror today. So yes, I think Washington's genius and the genius of Jefferson, Adams, Madison was exactly that self-restraint that they prided themselves on as gentlemen. They were gentlemen founders.
Dr. Wilson, the Washington model of leadership, moral leadership, seemed the dominant model for some 60 to 70 years in the early days of the Republic, and then along came Lincoln. And what did he bring to our understanding of moral character in the presidency?
Well, he had to start in a very different place, almost the opposite from Washington. He didn't start at the top. He wasn't well known. He wasn't revered. He wasn't first in the hearts of his countrymen. And I think he had to establish his credentials. I'm especially interested in how he was able, the role that his writing played in that, and that's what I'm working on now. And it's very clear that he had to establish what I think we could call his moral character before he thought he could get belief. Aristotle says that being believed depends on the audience believing in your moral character, that you're worthy of belief. I don't think Lincoln got his ideas from Aristotle, but he instinctively understood the same thing, that he had to have a basis to be understood. So the picture, what I admire about him is that he simply started with what they gave him. He wasn't well known. He was the minority president. He was easy to make fun of because he looked funny. He was from a backwoods state. And quickly the image of Lincoln became a rube. And he was really a cultivated, self-made, self-educated man. And he could have tried to persuade people that he really was clever and sophisticated, but he didn't do that. Instead, he would, when he was meeting with cultivated New Yorkers, he would tell stories in his Hoosier dialect. George Templeton Strong, whose wonderful diary tells us so much about the mood in the war, had several meetings with Lincoln. He came back from his first meeting, and he writes in his diary, he says, "Lincoln is a yahoo." And he goes on and he describes, and he tells in Lincoln's own dialect the story that Lincoln told. But then he says, but in spite of that, he's a straightforward, sincere, sensible, honest old codger. Now, I don't think Strong ever figured out that there was a purpose in that Yahoo persona that Lincoln went out of his way to exhibit to this sophisticated bunch of New Yorkers. Because he was interested in being known as sensible and straightforward and honest. And after the country got that sense of him, he was able to begin what I see as a campaign of direct public address, not through speeches, but through letters. And the first one is the famous letter to Horace Greeley. And that was so successful, it was unprecedented. People said...
This was to precede the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yes. And people said, well, it might be undignified to simply go into the newspapers. And while they were turning that over, Horace Greeley came out with an attack on Lincoln for not doing what he thought was necessary, and so Lincoln simply published what he had already written in a response to Greeley. And that was so successful that he then wrote a series of public letters, some of which his fame depends on, and that culminated in one of the few speeches that he gave as president, public speeches, the Gettysburg Address, which I think is a continuation of the same thing. But I think that he had to establish his character, his moral character, someone who was trustworthy, someone who was sensible, straightforward, and honest, in order to get his message across.
This is a theme I'd like to return to before we finish and explore more fully, but the Gettysburg Address, Emancipation Proclamation, and then the Gettysburg Address are really acts of what Jim Burns would call transformational leadership. But they go beyond the character of the individual to calling forth or shaping the character of the people and to appealing to the highest aspirations of the people. Was that what and did he use words then to transform our sense of who we were, who we are?
Well, I think he did in the Gettysburg Address. When he did, I think what you see there is he is saying, I think if you'd ask Americans who were self-conscious about this, what's the most important value that's talked about in the Declaration of Independence, they would have said liberty. And he could have used liberty, it would have worked very well, but instead he chose equality. And I think he did it deliberately and for a reason, and I think it's made all the difference. It has become part of our self-image. It has, some people have argued, completely transformed the way we think about the Declaration, the founding, what the nation is all about. But this doesn't go back directly to Jefferson, it goes through Lincoln, who says it's equality that the nation was established for.
Interesting question of whether it's still as important a value in our discourse as it was then, but perhaps that's for another panel. But I do take note of the fact we should record that at a time when there's a lot of talk about yahoos, that yahoos can be great leaders. During the midst of all this, not a bad thing for a lot of us in the blue states to remember, as some people sometimes think dismissively of those in the red states. Ron Walters, as you hear this, and then think, and also in more contemporary terms about more recent presidents, because Lincoln and Washington are up there on these pedestals for us. I'm reminded in more recent times that David McCullough, in his book on Truman, concluded that character is the single most important quality a president can have. Do you believe that continues to be true today?
Well, let me, if I would, David, just make a comment on these august gentlemen
Sure.
who are up on that pedestal that you have erected for them. Let me say that I think we have to look at them through the eyes of not only one nation, but two nations that were around in the 19th century. And in the words of George Frederickson, what we have been discussing really is the perspective of a Herrenvolk, which is to say that insofar as whites, and particularly white males, constituted the majority, and the leadership of that group had the kind of values that we're talking about, they were necessary values to bind up not only that group, but also the nation in which they participated. But African Americans were not in that. We were the other nation. And when one looks at the way in which African Americans tried to enter American society, that's a very unique perspective of judging presidents, because presidents had to exercise the leadership in order to accomplish that. But it's striking to me that they did it, well, for the most part, as a tactical necessity. I think what we have here really is the interplay, on the one hand, between the moral character of the president, on the other, between the political circumstances of his or her time that impinge on it. And for George Washington, what we are talking about, of course, was the way in which the nation was framed itself. And sometimes I wonder whether or not he was an Eisenhower. He was a general.
Well, Eisenhower was also a
Eisenhower was
right.
That's right. But he actually delegated a lot. And it put me in the mind of Eisenhower.
Yeah.
Here's someone who was not a hands-on, president. To that extent, I think what he did was he let the passions flow. It may have been shrewd, because out of that came sort of a negotiated nation, a negotiated constitution. And in the negotiation, I think Washington didn't play the major role. I guess the crisis of his career was maybe the Northwest Ordinance. I don't know whether or not you'd agree with that. But even in the Northwest Ordinance, there was a question about whether or not one would extend slavery to that territory. And here, I almost expected that Washington would, again, lay hands on the matter. He didn't. So I think in some of these great questions having to do with the role of slavery and with the role of African Americans, George Washington, I think he was aware of the fact that the South was a strong player in this and he had to keep them together. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think he did exercise a lot of sort of hands-on, moral, personal leadership with respect to those questions. Lincoln, I think, was pretty much in the same vein. I would say that the Emancipation Proclamation was one of those tactical moves on the part of Lincoln. He actually called Frederick Douglass in to talk to him about the Emancipation Proclamation and to try to get African Americans actually to fight on the side of the Union and to try to make Frederick Douglass really the principal agent for that. Douglass pushed him on that, as he would later push him on the question of a right to vote. And in both of those cases, Lincoln, again, was very much consumed by the tactical necessity of keeping a war going and then eventually keeping a Union together. And so the condition of blacks as citizens was a tactical or secondary issue. But I don't know when it is that we get to the question. I think maybe Lyndon Johnson, I would say. So you really get down to the point where these considerations were not simply tactical, that you did have real leadership exercise. I would also say Truman was pretty much in that same vein.
And the fact that Lincoln got back into politics and the Republican Party was formed to prevent the extension of slavery was a tactical matter?
Well, I didn't say it was all tactical, but the way in which they got back into office was with the votes of who? And that was one of the very strong driving motivations behind the people who put together the Reconstruction program. Now, in those days, and our historians have called them radical reconstructions. Well, I call them progressive reconstructionists. The history is going to be written about this era, and nobody would call the conservatives radical, right? But they are radical to me. But in that era, we somehow called them simply radical. We denuded them of the value, I think, the fairness value to which they should have.
You raised some really important questions about what moral leadership requires and the choices that one must make even as a moral leader. Do you sometimes have to compromise on what you would ultimately like to do to serve a higher purpose? If for example, Susan, that slavery had been inserted into the Constitution and the position had been taken on in the Constitutional Convention, and Washington had supported that, would it have split apart the Republic?
If slavery had been inserted?
If slavery had been inserted, or an abolition of slavery had been inserted in the Constitution, would the South have joined the Republic? Would there have been a Republic?
No, Washington was, and all of the founders were very conscious of having to make that compromise on the 3/5 rule.
So does that, by making that compromise, does that compromise their moral leadership is what I'm really asking. Is he still a moral leader even as he made the compromise? To Doug Wilson, was Lincoln still a moral leader even though he decided he could not push forward with emancipation very rapidly because he would lose the slave states that had not gone over to the Confederacy yet, the 4 states that hadn't gone over? I mean, this is one of the hardest questions of moral leadership, it seems to me, is when you make compromises that are short of what your principles are, but you do it for some larger good, and how do we see that?
I think in Lincoln's case, you can see him I think I see him trying to shape public opinion. And if you take the series of public letters that I was talking about, at the end of the fourth of those letters, the Conkling letter, which he writes to Illinois in September of '63, he takes a step there, I think, Ron, that's more than tactical. He says he risks saying something in fact, he keeps saying to them, to the crowd, "You support me on the Union, but you oppose the black soldiers." And then he argues but we need these black soldiers.
Yeah, tactical.
And he says to them also, what I'm saying is that he's not trying to make friends here. He's trying to be a leader and lead from something substantive. And he says, the black soldier, he has this marvelous image of the black soldier who clenches his teeth and goes ahead and fights the battle while draft dodgers and others are slinking at home, white. And he makes the contrast between whites who aren't fighting for their country and blacks who are saving the Union. And that isn't a popular thing to say. Let me just throw in one quick thing, because Jack Beatty said in the last panel that the issue of clemency was a moral character issue, a character issue. In 1862, the Sioux Indians went on a rampage in Minnesota and massacred a good many settlers. There was a tremendous outcry. There was a retaliation. The army moved against them. They rounded up all of these warriors, and they sent him and said, we have we're going to hang 300 of the worst offenders of these people. He said, send me the list and don't hang anybody till you hear from me. Then he went through this list very, very carefully, demanded to know what evidence was against these people, and he let all but 30 off the hook. This is very unpopular. He did this, I think, out of moral character, and I think we understand it as such, even though it didn't make him a lot of friends at the time.
Mm-hmm. Now, your question about moral leadership and compromises, I'd like to mention Jim Burns' first volume on FDR. It's called Roosevelt, the Lion and the Fox. And I think that title says it all about the qualities of a leader. A leader needs to be a lion, forceful, full of conviction, passion, compassion, but also a fox, also cunning, willing to conceal, willing to make compromises, knowing that compromises have to be made to achieve greater goals.
So I'm glad you took us there. It's a great segue. So this is what I've always puzzled about, and this question of character in the presidency. FDR's predecessor, Herbert Hoover, was certainly one of the most moral men in his private life of anybody we've had in the office. He was a real Boy Scout, and yet he was a failure as a president. Along comes FDR, and whose private life is, and I don't think would win the highest accolades for moral character, and certainly we learn much more about his private life later on. But in his public life, he was also very devious. And the lion and the fox comes right out of Machiavelli. In other words, and Herbert Hoover in his public life and his private life, absolutely moral. FDR comes along, his private life and public life, devious. Machiavellian, cut corners, even lied in the build-up to the Second World War. Who was the better leader for the country?
Roosevelt.
That's what I want to get at, that tension. Help me understand that tension, because we see in Washington and Lincoln, given the reservations that you've expressed, still what we often hold out as the moral leaders and that's the model of leadership. And yet along comes FDR, and it raises profoundly different questions, difficult questions for us as we talk about moral leadership. And how do we think about that? What conclusions does that lead you to about the nature of leadership?
Well, real moral leadership, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Eleanor Roosevelt, these are not politicians. These are people who can be moral leaders because they don't have to run campaigns, broker deals, make compromises. Their compass can always be set at north. But as soon as you're a politician, you have to broker deals, you have to make compromises. And probably we want politicians who can do that. Machiavelli also said that the prince should try to always to do good, but if he needs to, he should be ready to do evil. And Max Weber, the great sociologist at the turn of the last century, said that if you want to save your soul, don't go into politics.
Well, I think he had a point there.
Which one? Weber?
Weber.
You've been there. You've been in the arena.
I have been there. understand that the character of the nation is simply one compromise after another, you end up, I think, in a very bad place. At the end of the day, you have to have leadership, which is really Rawlsian in a sense, which says we are pursuing something called justice. Mm-hmm. And that really is the foundation of the nation that we want to build, and to strive for that. So if you simply let the fox and the chicken fight, anything is liable to happen. And that's one of the reasons why I think Lyndon Baines Johnson sticks out in my mind as a great president, because, but now let me be clear, from Truman to Lyndon Baines Johnson, there was the emergence of a very powerful movement in this country. And so I don't think they were autonomous actors in the sense that they simply did this out of the strength of their own conviction. They were forced to consider these issues of justice. Truman, of course, in 1944, his report to secure these rights was very powerful. He led his Attorney General, Luce, to begin to pursue court cases on behalf of the NAACP. He responded to the pressure that the NAACP was beginning to bring him in that time. The same thing with Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson responded to the civil rights movement as early as 1957 as the master of the Senate, for those of you who've read Carroll's book. And he began then to move, I think, from somebody who was consumed by tactical considerations and consumed by a negotiative posture to somebody who actually became a student of Martin Luther King Jr. He began to believe. So when he made that famous speech at Howard University, I think Johnson was a believer, a leader and a believer. I sometimes think that if we had put the civil rights agenda to a survey or a test, we'd still be sitting here today outside of society. But at the end of the day, it really takes someone with vision to say, we have to go in the direction of justice.
It's like Harry Truman said, if Moses had taken a Gallup poll, he never would have gotten out of Egypt. Doug Wilson, help us think through this question of what we ought to be teaching the next generation about what moral leadership is and what's required in order to be effective in the public arena, in politics, in the presidency, in order to be considered a moral leader. The nature of compromises one should be willing to entertain and the quality of Machiavellian strategies or tactics one should be willing to pursue. How does one think about that? How does one frame that argument about what you should be willing to do in order to succeed?
If you want to learn from Lincoln, I think an obvious place to look would be even-handedness. It was a patronage government. The government was run by patronage. He had to give out thousands of jobs. There was all kinds of pressure. So he had to work with the party system and the party leaders, but he insisted that you had to work with the other party, that if you wanted to represent the Union, the whole country, you couldn't count out the other party, even though the other party was hostile to you. Mm-hmm. So he appointed Democratic generals, and this got him into lots of trouble with people in his party. He kept insisting, he kept trying to reach out to Democratic governors and show that he was reasonable about various issues like the draft and so forth, even ones that were very nasty to him. He took the position that what we're dealing with, he says in one of his letters, is too vast for malicious dealing. That is, it's too important, if we're talking about the whole country, the salvation of the country, to be partisan. And he had more provocation on both sides, because the leaders of his own party were against him and critical of him. They thought he was too slow. The opposition party thought he was too fast. He had to have incredible belief in his own ability, but he also preached an even-handedness and matters of great importance to not be concerned about partisanship, not do it on a party basis. So I think that's a great lesson.
So it's all about setting sort of the thrust and tone and purpose of a presidency toward hitching it to a higher goal, to a higher set of goals, very much the kind of transformational leadership, but aspiring to calling upon people's higher aspirations, calling forth their better angels in their nature.
That's right.
As Madison would put it. Susan, in your book that you co-authored with Jim Burns about the three Roosevelts, you quote FDR, the famous quote from FDR, and I wonder if you could comment a little more on this. The presidency is not merely an administrative office, that is the least of it. It is preeminently a place of moral leadership. Now, that's his thesis. But listen to what he says moral leadership is about, how he defines what the content of moral leadership. All of our great presidents were leaders of thought at times when certain historic ideas in the life of the nation had to be clarified. Washington personified the idea of federal union. Jefferson practically originated the party system as we now know it by opposing the democratic theory to the republicanism of Hamilton. Two great principles of our government were ever put beyond question by Lincoln. And he goes on, this is what the office is, a superb opportunity for applying to new conditions, the simple rules of human conduct to which we always go back. Without leadership alert and sensitive to change, we lose our way. He's really talking about a very different kind of leadership than what we, in our discourse today, we talk about moral leadership today, well, has the person got good values? But he is really saying moral leadership is about whether we call forth from followers and from the whole society, whether we help to clarify what the great choices are and call forward people to their highest aspirations, as I read that. Am I misunderstanding that?
No, I think that's exactly the point. FDR and the other great moral leaders, transformational leaders, knew what their goals were. And they were willing to make some compromises, but the compromises weren't merely for the sake of compromising. They were to try to get to those goals, to further the aims, whether it's winning the war, social security, unemployment, GI Bill of Rights. The great achievements came from Roosevelt's willing to compromise, but never taking his mind and his heart off the ultimate goals. And how did he get there? Perseverance, 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 to the extent of trying to pack the court or purge the party. He would stop at nothing in order to attain his goals, coming back, coming back, coming back. And we've mentioned President Clinton. Let's go back to President Clinton and his health plan. This was one of his top priorities. People are still talking about trying to solve the problem of inaccessible and unaffordable health care. What did President Clinton do in his first term? He proposed a health bill, and it was not successful, and so he dropped it like a hot potato. And for the next 7 years, no one talked about health care. No one came back to it. That's not leadership. Leadership is going back, going back, going back. And interestingly, Jim Burns, my co-author, interviewed Clinton in 1992 during the campaign, and Clinton knew about Jim's work and said that, in fact, he did want to become a transformational leader. And Jim said, well, how is that possible with checks and balances and all of the other blocks that you will face? And Clinton said, I will nag, nag, nag. And in fact, he didn't do that. He didn't show that perseverance, that conviction, that commitment to really realize those goals. He took an opposite strategy. He took a strategy of centrism. And we make the point in everything we write that real change, transformational change, and moral leadership will not come out of the center. It will come out of an ideology. It will come out of convictions on the left or on the right. Unfortunately now, President Bush is showing a lot of commitment and conviction. The question is whether that will advance the cause of justice and equality in this country. Perhaps not. It might set us back. But on the Democratic side or on the Republican side, that's what leadership takes. Passion, conviction, the Washingtonian courage, and naturally competence, and a desire to see justice and to see more social and economic equality and justice in this country.
We're going to go to the floor in just a moment. If you would like to ask a question, please come to the microphone, but I want to raise one more question with Ron Walters as we prepare for your questions. And that is the connection between private life and public virtue, or public life and leadership. And you raised the name of Martin Luther King. Was Martin Luther King Jr. a moral leader?
Well, I think he was, but I think we have to specify the realm of his moral leadership, because I don't think that they're the same. Let me go all the way back. We've been talking about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. One of the individuals who actually visited them both, and visited both of them near the end of their lives, was General Lafayette. He challenged both of them to let their slaves go. And the discussions between them were private discussions. And it was clear that even in the private realm, there was some sentiment there on the part of Washington and on the part of Lincoln to do that. But then, of course, they made excuses. I mean, there were reasons why they felt in the larger scheme of another realm of politics, they couldn't do it. I think that's very instructive to where we are today, because
But Washington did eventually.
he did eventually. He did
But
eventually.
are we to take from that that the real lesson of that is that the French can instruct us on moral behavior?
I think they should instruct us more often than we are willing to follow them, especially right now. But I think that there is
Come back to King. Tell me about King.
Right,
But
let me
King's
come
private
back to
life
King.
was anything but a model. So I'm trying to figure out whether, in the end of the day, one judges him to be a moral leader.
What I'm trying to say is, you can't simply use moral qua moral. There is a difference in public and private leadership and morality. And that in the example I was trying to make, I think it follows with King. In the realm of public morality, King was a national leader. One of the reasons why Lyndon Johnson responded to him was because of the moral authority, not just of King, but of the cause that he was trying to put forward to the nation. King had another realm, a private realm, in which he was criticized because of that. Bill Clinton, the same thing. I mean, here we have, someone said in the earlier panel that the private morality of Bill Clinton was one thing, and the public morality was another, and that the American people were capable of actually disaggregating between the two, and that they preferred a president who was very good in the realm of the use of power. Because that was the realm in which the president is going to satisfy their needs. That's what we need a president, to use power to satisfy those needs. So I think that this is something we need to discuss, because what we have today is an attempt at a conflation of the two realms, to make them all the same, to make them simply one. And I don't think that that's wise, neither do I think it's possible.
Taylor Branch, the great biographer of King, once told me that he thought King was actually wrestling with his private life, and he continued to tell his followers, "I'm not as good as you think I am."
That's right.
He never pretended to be a saint. But Taylor also felt that King was, the fact that he was wrestling with his private demons, if one may call them that, spurred him on in his public life, that he was even more passionate about change in the public realm, and he was willing to put himself at greater danger, and because of what he knew, he was trying to sort of, in effect, compensate him.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that.
You wouldn't? That's
No,
interesting.
I wouldn't agree with that, because I think that, if anything, King was, he understood the cause.
Right.
And he understood, I think, something that, again, I'm going back to Lafayette now, because this is very important. He said, one of the reasons I have been here in this country was because of the goals of the revolution. And the values that came out in the revolution, I think, are values that actually have knit this country together. We need a president with the kind of vision to complete the goals of that revolution. We have an unfinished revolution. And I think what King was able to do was to reach back and appropriate those goals, put them in a moral language, and then sell them to presidents and to the people.
And the revolution remains unfinished.
Right.
I'll go to the floor. Yes, sir, if you'll identify yourself.
Reg McKean. I'd like to try a thought experiment and imagine Washington or Lincoln engaging in presidential campaigning in our own 21st century that we're living in, don't the members of the panel think that Washington or Lincoln would have made a few telephone calls and put a quick stop to the vicious smears in the South Carolina primary in 2000 against John McCain, or to put a stop to the vicious Swift boat ads of August 2004?
Who would like to respond?
I would.
All right. This is not time for a lot of partisanship, I hope. So let me just preface that. Okay, but reflective conversation. I'm sure there'll be a barb or two included in there. I have no doubt. Ron Walters is never, he'll never hold back totally.
Well, I'm not going to go down the partisan road, but I would say this, that we've had some comment this morning about why it is that we have these two groups of people, one 59 million and the other 55 million, and why nothing seems to work in terms of logic and morality. Indeed, we have two definitions of morality that are split by ideology. I think that's a key, and one of the reasons I wanted to say something because my last book was entitled White Nationalism, Black Interest. Now, it's a book about nationalism. Americans don't like to think of themselves as nationalists. But if anything, let's put that aside. We are in one of the most ideological periods of American history. And yet, we sometimes are mystified by why things don't work out. Well, they don't work out because the sides have chosen up. This has nothing to do with logic. It has to do with which side of the ball are you on. And I think unless we factor that into our consideration, we will not be able to answer this question that you just gave us.
Okay, what about the telephone calls?
Thank you, Mr. Gergen.
Would they make the telephone calls?
That's what I'm saying. What's happening down there is that this election, on both sides of the ball, was an ideological contest. It was not simply an election contest. It was a contest to see which one of these ideologies is going to control the United States of America. And that's what, when people look at that big, map of the United States and they see that red and that blue, that's what they think about. Who's going to eventually control this? So this is not simply about two individuals. It is about a much larger issue of what sort of ideology, what sort of vision controls this country right now.
I think it's about what we used to think were clean campaign procedures, but...
I wish it were just about that.
There, of course, weren't clean campaigns back then. Washington probably would have made a phone call if there had been telephones asking his own supporters not to attack another candidate, but Washington himself was attacked in the press, and there was nothing that he could do about it. Luckily, he didn't take any action to suppress freedom of the press. That honor was reserved for John Adams, who signed the Alien and Sedition Act in 1798.
Right. Washington would have called Jefferson and said, stop attacking me from within my own cabinet.
Jefferson done?
Yeah. Please, sir.
My name's Calvin Harry. I'm from Boston. It occurred to me during this conversation about moral character of the presidents that some gave us a demonstration after their terms in office of their character. I'm thinking particularly of John Quincy Adams in his struggle against the gag rule over slavery after he finished his time as president, and also Jimmy Carter, for example, in his entire life since he left office. Are there any other examples that might come to mind?
Sorry, I missed something you said. You said examples of what? On both
examples of the character of these presidents. Some had an opportunity after their terms in office to demonstrate what they were made of.
Right.
And others, their lives were cut short. But are there any other examples that anyone can think of?
Not Lincoln.
Hoover, some people are citing Hoover. And as an example of, and there's value to that, because Hoover was in some ways like Jimmy Carter, a man who in office was less effectual than people thought he might be, and after leaving office, particularly in Carter's case, but in Hoover's case before, was extraordinarily effective in a variety of public causes. But are there others that you would cite?
Well, I heard someone in the audience mention Theodore Roosevelt, but I would say that all of Theodore Roosevelt's more difficult qualities came out after his presidency. His cult of hypermasculinity knew no bounds after he was out of office. Just when he was a year before his death, he still wanted to go into World War I and take his own battalion and repeat the spectacle of San Juan Hill.
And bull mooses eat their young too, right?
On the other side of the coin, nobody's mentioned Nixon yet and moral character.
Right.
I was recently looking at an almanac of American history for my students, and I just picked the year of 1972 and saw what Nixon actually did in 1972. Took the last ground troops out of Vietnam, had an agreement with Pierre Trudeau of Canada to clean up the Great Lakes, raised Social Security benefits tremendously, had a new program for college aid to students, and there were and much else in 1972. We compared that one year with the 8 years of Reagan, and the 8 years of Reagan, in fact, didn't seem to come up to everything that Nixon had accomplished in 1972, in spite of this mean-spirited, vindictive, corrupt character. So again, this brings us to character and leadership and the tremendous ambiguity that we're faced with.
That's a very good way to phrase it there, frame it about the ambiguities and the complexities, that this is not as simple and straightforward a subject as it might first seem in terms of what leadership is about. Please, sir.
If I recall correctly, and I'm asking for your views, Reinhold Niebuhr, in his 1934, I guess, book, Moral Man, Immoral Society, I guess. I presume you're all familiar with it better than I am. But he argues that it is immoral for a moral man to not do what his constituents want done, even if it is immoral for himself. And that makes sense when you think about it. And when I recall when Ashcroft was being confirmed by the Senate, one of the reasons people who opposed him confirmed him because they were so confident that he was such a moral man that he would support abortion rights even though he felt it was immoral. Does that make sense to any? I mean, it makes sense to me. Does it make sense to you? And I'm wondering how you respond to the proposition, as I think, if I understood him correctly, Niebuhr was saying, society is inevitably immoral because moral men are doing what they're supposed to do.
Well, there is a morality of power at the heart of your question. Because there are three forms of leadership. You have agents, you have delegates, and you have representatives.
Well, I'm talking about presidents.
No, I understand. But all of them fit because you have models of all three of them throughout history. And so the question is, which one are you at any given moment? There is an implicit responsibility of accountability to power. And I think for me, that's a moral question. Do you give back to people what they give to you in terms of power to govern? And so that the question of accountability is with us today. I think what we're having today through the privatization of so many public policies, to me that is immoral. That is not accountable to the general good, to the common welfare, to privatize public resources.
We have time for one more question. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
My name is David Svensson. It's been 200 years now, plus, since Washington was elected president. Isn't it beyond time for an American president to say, on behalf of the United States, I apologize for slavery, or for an American presidential candidate to say, when I am elected president, I will, on behalf of the United States, apologize for slavery? Could I expect to hear this from a president in my lifetime or my daughter who's 21 in her lifetime?
I thought
Well, you
that
know
one
my
of the
answer, I'd
presidents
be,
did that.
Let's see.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
I thought that one of the recent presidents did apologize for slavery.
I think
No.
when Bill Clinton went to Africa,
we've not had an apology.
what's that?
We've not had an apology for slavery.
I think he apologized for slave trade when he was in Africa.
Yeah, he said that the slave trade, that the United States didn't always do what it wanted to do, and the slave trade was wrong. But he was roundly excoriated on the floor of the Congress the next morning.
Yeah, but to go to the two of you, Doug?
As far as Lincoln was concerned, he was always, and I think it relates to this other question about public and private morality, he was always careful to say before the Emancipation Proclamation, because he was being urged to do something about slavery, that we have to follow the Constitution, whatever my own personal view is. And he has several letters of this kind where he distinguishes between my own personal view about slavery and what the Constitution calls for. I think this is one of his reasons that it's hard to get at Lincoln from our perspective, and that is that he cared deeply about the Constitution. And he says, since slavery is guaranteed in the Constitution, and since the fugitive slave law is guaranteed in the Constitution, we have to accept them, even though we hope we can get past them. But we have to accept the Constitution. And the extreme abolitionists took the position, well, if that's the law, then the law is wrong, and the Constitution is a covenant with death.
If I may then, with regard to my question, then I should not expect to see it in my lifetime, or my daughter who's 21 would not expect to see that in her lifetime from an American president or from a candidate for American president.
I sure hope so, but you're the advisor to presidents. Would you advise them to
that's
apologize?
I must tell you, sir, that I think that American history is a mix of moral and immoral actions on the past. And while I think an American president should clearly condemn aspects of slavery, the repression of Native Americans, the slaughter of Native Americans, in many cases brutality, other things, other depredations in which we've engaged, the way we treated Japanese Americans during the Second World War. There are many instances in which we've gone off the tracks. But I also think that should be done with a certain degree of understanding and not imposing the morality of one age on those who lived in another and to condemn them out of hand. I think that's unfair to the individuals who lived in those periods. And it shows a certain kind of, and I would hate to think, as Jefferson would say, I tremble to think how God will think of how we're living today. When you think of some of the things we're engaged in today.
Yes.
Let's not get too self-righteous about the past.
Well, now, David, let me say something. I have heard what amounts to historical relativist response before. But let me just say that you ought to read something, and you ought to read William Pitt the Younger's statement the night that the Parliament debated the English secession of the slave trade. I go back and read it every now and then because I have to remind myself that this was the question of the immorality of slavery was not simply an evolutionary process. People knew at the time that it was wrong. So I don't quite buy that we shouldn't judge individuals today with respect to the standards of the past, because there was implicit in the standards of the past a moral critique at the highest level in British society of slavery. Now, we chose to ignore that critique for our own reasons. I give you that. But the fact of the matter is, we knew that it was wrong. Final thing I will say is that you're raising a very important question, because there is right now in this country a discussion about reparations and an apology for slavery. The unfinished agenda of slavery is that. And until that happens, you're not going to have, however material benefits African Americans accrue to themselves. Psychologically and spiritually, you're not going to have people who consider themselves to be full citizens of this country. That's it.
We can go on and argue. I would just add that for a society that tolerates the greatest levels of inequality in our lifetimes, we should be a little slow to be self-righteous about the past, and we'd be far more productive to pay attention to how we can correct the inequities of today than to get ourselves wrapped up in a lot of conversations about whether about our past, because I think that we only find that divisive. But I do want to conclude. Clearly, the hook is here. The time has passed when we should conclude. Perhaps I'm overstepping as a moderator, but what I draw from this conversation is the notion that clearly we want to encourage models of moral character in people's private lives and the leaders of our private lives, but that we should accept the fact that people are human and there will be flawed. There have been very few, perhaps since Washington, who have been perfect, perhaps Lincoln. And to some degree, we need to accept the fact that there's going to be, that Machiavelli lives in public life and may even need to be embraced to achieve certain ends, but that the highest level of moral leadership is that, to go back to Jim Burns, which calls forth from the people their highest aspirations, which calls forth the better angels of our nature, which calls to us and inspires us to live at a higher plane, and that our best moral leaders have been ones who have done that and have helped us live in new ways. So in that light, and I think that Ron, I particularly appreciate the passion you brought to these questions, even though we may disagree here and there. But we should join in thanking Doug Wilson, Susan Dunn, and Ron Walker.